Check, test, 1 2 1 2. Check, test, check, test, 1 2 1 2. This is the upstairs mic. Upstairs balcony mic. Check, test, 1 2 1 2. Upstairs balcony mic. Check, test, 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. Check, test, 1 2 3. Upstairs balcony mic. Upstairs balcony mic. Check, test, 1 2 1 2. Up here, I can just kind of hear it a little bit. It's not super loud, but I can hear myself. Okay.
Yep. I know a few of us are still grabbing coffee, but I can guarantee I have probably a full hour's worth of content to squish in, and I'm probably going to get started while last few folks just grab a quick beverage. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming and showing interest in hearing more about the university's finances. I'm always open to questions. Today I might not be able to get to all the questions. We had a number of questions come through our pre-registration, so I want to thank everyone for their level of interest and also say that we'll respond to all of those within a week's time and post them and make sure that you guys have the link to where to find those. Before I get started, I wanted to highlight that I will have a few special guests, although one will come up here and with me cover a couple of slides, and that's Patty McDougall, our interim provost, as well as I think Cheryl will be joining us online, and we have a question queued up for her that came through pre-registration. So before I get started, I want to give a land acknowledgement and just remind everyone as we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6, territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. The agenda is somewhere behind me to the side, and what I want to do is make sure that you have a globally grounded context for how some of the jurisdictions are funding education, and then bring it into a Canadian landscape and land on Saskatchewan specifically. I think it's important to start with a global lens, and you'll see why, because a lot of what happens around the globe has a relationship to what our jurisdictional governments might do here. Other things that I'll touch on today, and Patty will help me, is talking about the MOU, our Memorandum of Understanding, our second agreement that was recently announced on November 3rd, and its companion document, which is all about accountability. And we'll talk about what some of the details of that is. Finally, we'll talk about our financial outlook, and it might not all be perfectly in that order because I've made some changes to the flow, which I think you'll find really helpful. The last thing I want to say, for those who haven't sent in a question, and you may have one, you can ask toward the end. Heather is here. She has agreed to help moderate the questions at the end. She has some of the pre-registration questions as well to highlight. And anyone online who wishes to send something in can send it in through the Strategic Finance Office, and we will include that in the list of the other questions that we respond to. So without further ado, let's just start again looking at the globe. Last year I covered the entire globe, so if you're interested in all the different importing and exporting jurisdictions around the world, because that's what we do, we have importing countries that take in international enrollment. We also have exporting countries that intentionally send their students out because they don't have the infrastructure to educate their students. And so this is not an unnatural phenomenon. It's a known strategy for each country. The ones I wanted to focus on today with intent was the Nordic countries. And what I wanted to highlight is over the last 10 years is they've shifted from an incremental-based funding model, which was all about enrollment, to output-based funding. So they get their funding based on delivery of outputs. So it might be jobs, it could be other things linked to those jurisdictions' government strategies. And that's important. The only holdout in the Nordic region right now is Iceland. They are the only one in those countries that have held out and continue to do incremental. But you can imagine the pressure when all the other schools around them have made this shift, that they as a government would feel that they might need to move to output-based funding as well. When we look at Germany, Germany is a land of tuition-free. It is more heavily supported by a percentage of the GDP in the Germanic region. But again, I wanted to highlight they've shifted towards output-based funding. And I'm going to make these emphases continually because you're going to see where we're going to go. The one thing I'd say about Germany, though, is when they do get their funding, they have very limited autonomy. And the one example I would have that resonates with me locally here is more and more of our funding is getting targeted or directed to certain things. So we're losing some autonomy in where we put the dollars we get from the government. When you look at the public, not the private, United States of America, what you've all seen probably in the news is sort of a federal pressure on the education system for post-secondary. But between the state funding and the federal pressure, they too are moving towards more of an impact focus. So looking at what those schools are doing for the graduates and how those graduates are then behaving. And we've all heard stories about wokeness and whether that's a good or bad thing. I know the federal government down there has a lens. Not here to judge that, but just to emphasize that funding is being tied to federal and state convictions and priorities, and again, focused on impact. I always like to throw China in. People wonder why China? It's very intentional. The one thing as an accountant that I look at when I look at global funding frameworks for post-secondary education is who seems to have a model that's sustainable. And that's where I go to China. China has a model where it's definitely 4% of GDP is what's invested into their post-secondary education system. They do have a two-tier system, meaning if you're research intensive, you'll receive a bigger proportion of that 4%. But remember that number, 4% of GDP is what the educational system gets there for the university and colleges. The other thing that I want to note about it, kind of like Germany, so you think about what could go wrong when you have too much money. Maybe I put too much in administration and not enough in direct teaching. China has very specific caps on how much money that they get can be put into teaching, administration, student supports, capital, and research. So very stay in these lanes, and if you stay in these lanes, then you have your funding. Switching over to Canada, I just want to re-emphasize something I said last year. In our country, our federal government predominantly supports research, and our provincial jurisdictions predominantly support the education, the graduates that come out of our system. So they are predominantly supporting our operating fund, where the colleges, schools, and support units receive their payroll from. That's an important distinction, but then when you look at each of these provinces, each government is establishing how they will fund the universities or colleges within their provincial borders. And so when you start out on the East Coast, you can see my little codes here, and you'll get the slides afterwards, and can rewatch the recording for as many times as you enjoy. But if you look, if you're in PEI, they have a tuition cap of 6.5% annual tuition increases for that year 24-25. If you were in Newfoundland or Labrador, you would have a 4% for that year. But every now and then what Newfoundland does is they look across the other systems and they do what's called a catch-up. And so that will actually occur next year when their tuition rate will go up by 67%. In Quebec, you've all heard, and the incremental is the I, and H is hybrid. Hybrid means some of their money is incremental, which is based on student enrollment, but the other portion, the hybrid portion, is performance-based funding, meaning output-driven. You have to deliver these things, and if you deliver these things against these targets, you get this amount of funding. So hybrid model and 3% lift to their tuition. You will have heard also in the news the problematic part for Quebec is, unlike our national system getting the federal policy really limiting and constraining our international enrollment, Quebec has an extra layer of that. So whatever the federal government is doing, the province has come in and done further. They've reduced further the amount of international participation. That's really to preserve foreign language, the French-speaking cultural content of the province. If you look down here, you'll see New Brunswick. It's incremental funding and a no cap. So absolutely silent between the government and the school on how tuition is regulated. And if you look at the schools within that jurisdiction, they're all increasing tuition between 3 and 5%. And as you go across, you can read Alberta there has PBF. That means they are of a performance-based funding model. So not only do they perhaps have something like an accountability framework, which ties them to delivering certain priorities and goals and targets, but their money, their funding is tied to the achievement of those targets. And as you go across, you'll see in the middle there we are, we're incremental. And for that year, 24-25, we had a 4% agreed upon tuition rate increase, domestic increase limit. And so I say that cautiously. We have in our act the right to set our own tuition, and we use a tuition framework for that, which has principles about access, accessibility, affordability. But we do agree with the government on sort of what that sort of ceiling will be. And so this year, in the November 3rd announcement that you would have recently heard about our funding and our future MOU2, we've agreed that that ceiling would be 3% or lower. So really, instead of just saying 3%, where everyone would get a 3%, we're going through the exercise of working through, they said we need to see some zeros in there, some ones in there, and some twos. So that's a difficult exercise that we'll be going through with the colleges and schools. The key thing to point out here is, well, you see varied tuition increases, some at 0, some no cap, some 3, some 4. What's also happening is tuition is one piece, one major piece of what funds the operating fund, which is where all our payroll comes from. And the other piece is the operating grant, which is the provincial funding as a % of GDP. And remember the number I told you to keep in your head about China. Okay, 4% of GDP. Well, if you're in Newfoundland, 30 years ago, it was 1.2% of GDP, and today is 0.9% of GDP. If you're, let me pick on New Brunswick, where they have no cap, it used to be 0.4% of GDP, and now 0.24% of GDP. And if I go across the entire country, same thing. It's all declined anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 percentages, and when I say that, I mean times 10. So in Saskatchewan, we've gone from 30 years ago, 1.2% of GDP to 0.74% today. And so when people say, why could we run a university with no problem, years ago, and why are we complaining about financial challenges and constraints now? There's two things happening to us in concert. There's the fact that we're getting less and less as a percentage of GDP invested into our post-education system, which one and some will argue is a driver of economic development for the province and the country. So there's that, and the fact that we have a federal policy that's limiting the one place we were going for inflationary support, which was our international students. Not just for inflationary support to enrich the campus in the discussion within the class, but it was an inflationary source of funding that was helping the universities, I'll say the word, get by amongst 30 years declining investment from the provincial government. The key thing that I also want to say before I leave this slide is that as you look at all of the hybrids, the H's and the performance-based, there is a movement, just like in the United States, just like in the Nordic countries, just like in Germany, for more output-based, impact-based indicators. What do I get for the dollar I give? And so that's one thing that we're going to need to think about. Not just that we're very busy, because we're all busy all the time, but what are we delivering for the economy, and what are we delivering for society? And that's the language that we'll need to be talking about in the future. I want to show this slide again. I showed it last fall, and if you're unfamiliar with it, I'd spend more time on it last fall and go back to that video. But just a reminder that when money comes into the university, it goes into one of these swim lanes. It's either in the operating fund because it's provincial grant money or tuition or some investment income. And if not, it's raised in the ancillary fund because we sold housing, food, parking, and that is helpful to keep up the student support services and reinvest in capital and reinvest sometimes in the operating fund. And those are our two unrestricted funds. Everything else is restricted, meaning I can't take from it to pay payroll over in the operating fund where our payroll predominantly exists for those in the room. So we have a capital fund, and that comes in restricted for a project. And then we have the research fund, again, comes in restricted for a project, cannot cross-subsidize and borrow this money to pay this over here. And finally, we have the trust fund, which is two funds together, the endowment fund and the student scholarship and bursaries. And so when we think about the campaign, and a very common question, and Cheryl will come online in a moment when I'm done the presentation and speak to it. When we do the campaign, that money is going into predominantly one of these restricted funds. And also when we do the campaign, it's not like on the last day of the campaign when it closes that we actually receive the check for $571 million. The campaign started 10 years ago, and 80% of that money has been received over 10 years. And out of that 80% received, some of it was permanently put into the trust fund where we only spend the interest on it. So if it was meant for scholarships, the donation goes in here, the interest on it is what we spend on scholarships. So it's not free, unencumbered money. It has a purpose, the donor put the purpose on it. Same thing with the other restricted funds. When we get money in from donors for research or capital, again, it sits in the restricted fund. The point is there's only a few sources of funding in the operating fund, and I've been making the case that those sources haven't been growing so much, the provincial grant and the tuition revenues. The USask operating fund, where mainly our colleges, schools, and support units are paid for, or paid from, has sources that are mainly these three, and the last one's pretty small comparatively. In the operating fund, this university has about $850 million. It sounds like a lot, but $270 million of those dollars were directly negotiated arrangements by the college or school itself. That means $270 million is not money that I'm allocating. It is based on the success and work of those colleges directly, and it goes directly to them. What means is there's about $575 million left, and it's in these three buckets that it's come in to be allocated. However, remember I said there's some regions in the globe that direct and don't give you the flexibility with the money. Our grant is the same. What used to be a small proportion of our grant as inflexible but targeted has grown to be 1/3 of our operating grant. We're told exactly where to put it. Predominantly it's in human health resource professional seats as well as vet med. So I can't take that money and give it to the library or take it and give it to SENS or any other college. It has to go where we're told to put it. What's left is about $200 million in the provincial operating and a bit over $200 million in the tuition revenues that we collect, and a little bit, like about 10 or more million in investment income. And what we do with that, after we give all of the tuition out to the colleges and schools, is the residual, the operating grant and the investment income. We first pay the institutional costs. The institutional costs are costs we cannot get out of, but we try to manage and keep contained. So those are paying for the lawyers, paying for the insurance, paying for the utilities, and so forth. It's about $100 million. And so as you can see, as I whittle this down, when it comes back down to it, you're left with not a lot, but that is what is covering all the remaining support units. And when you look at the inflation year over year on that funding, even though we're mainly a people-driven operation, the inflation on the funding and the cycle that we're going into, 26, 27, when we did the planning, even with the 3% lift that we heard on November 3rd, still results in support units receiving a smaller allocation than they received last year. Because there isn't a dearth or a wealth, there is a dearth. There isn't a wealth of tuition revenue growth. There isn't a wealth of operating growth. And that operating growth is spread across the entire university. So it can't just be there to support unit growth. So the university colleges and schools would have seen about under 2% lift from that November 3rd announcement. And the support unit, and that's predominantly their tuition, their enrollment plan that drove that lift. We're paid from sort of the residual of the operating funds, the support units, and they received year over year because the money wasn't there. Approximately a 0.6% decrease. So to say that there's some financial challenges is truthful, despite the wonderful news that we got from the government. The next thing I want to say before I show you some numbers, because I am an accountant, I can't do a presentation without numbers, is that we're currently in this period, entering it here, we're in the financial town hall. But when we released the budget templates to all the leaders, so the deans and the vice presidents, we included a small allocation for strategic priorities. And I know someone asked before we did today's town hall and the registration, how do you actually make sure there's some money to direct to priorities? So out of those sources of money we take in that we actually have some control on, they're not directed, we do take a small percentage of that money and we put it into our strategic allocation pot. And so this year we put out a call for strategic investment proposals to apply for the SIF, I call it this acronym, the SIF. There's $5 million in it. Now that would be bigger, but what happened this year is we looked across of the colleges and schools hardest hit by international enrollment decline, and we used 2/3 of what we had in our strategic investment fund to lift those area ups because they're mission critical. And so rather than someone taking a large hit because suddenly, because of the federal government policy, those international students weren't here and we're down about 500 students, we supplemented their income temporarily with an adjustment. And those are the types of tough decisions that the VPs make together and then the president endorses. Again, if I go back to this image, look at the bottom highlight. You might say, why doesn't Dee care about some of the deficits over in those restricted funds? Why is she only awake at night about the operating fund deficit? And again, this is the one where our payroll comes out, and the only way that that is okay, a deficit, is if we have prior year savings to draw down and use for that payroll. So you'll see that deficit. Now, I've been communicating that we're headed to some financial challenges because we haven't gotten the requisite operating grant lift that matches our inflation over several past years. Over the last 5 years, the average provincial operating grant lift was 0.64%. So you can imagine when everyone knows that our payroll, which is most of our budgets, is going up anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on your mix of employees. So that keeps me awake at night. These ones I don't get concerned about because there's this fancy thing in restricted funds. You spend the money you got, and this is a window of time. And if you do the continuum of time, when you see a deficit there, it's a 12-month window, but the money came in the other 12-month window. We're not spending money we haven't got in the bank. The restricted funds are segregated so that we don't spend them on payroll, but we're holding them for these restricted purposes. The other fancy thing that happens, and people get confused, is that we do this funny thing called accrual accounting, and even though we built a bunch of buildings for $51 million in the budget year, we reverse that because we're going to use that building for the next 40 years, and we only take a little sliver of it for 1 year. So then all of a sudden we jump into a surplus at a consolidated level. So just keep that in mind. Cash, this is cash, and that is the one that keeps me up at night. This is why that one keeps me up at night. When you look at our numbers, what we really have relied on isn't the provincial operating grant to give us the inflationary funding we need. What we've been relying on is tuition. International mix is a really important component of that. We're not suffering like Ontario, Quebec, and some of the other areas because they were highly, highly exposed to international enrollment, relying on it for their growth. We were approaching 10%. And as a consequence of federal policy, we're coming back down, and Patty, correct me, we're closer to 5%? Under 5% international now. But you imagine if you were in Ontario and Quebec and you were previously 30+% international and you churned down to 5% international, it would be tens of $1 million hit. Here, what you can see is undergraduate international revenues. At one point, we were, a year that we were down, it was 40 million. The year before that, that bottom line, that 4.7%, the year before said 12% year-over-year growth. When we get that kind of growth, we can afford the inflation that occurs across the academy. Here, what you're seeing is a dial knob being turned down really fast on us, where we're having to react really quickly to what I call changing circumstances. And we can't dwell on the fact that this is happening to us, we actually have to act. And so I've been signaling this. This was a forecast I shared with the senior leaders at a summit in August. Based at the time, what we understood was potentially a 0% operating grant lift coming in MOU2. So for the next 4 years, if we got no additional funding, which was something that they were floating, we said, this is what we look like. Our expense line, being the yellow dotted line here, was rising above the revenue line, which is the solid green line, below it. You always want the solid revenue line to be above the dotted expense line. That's not hard to figure out. But this is what was happening. We were kind of hovering around this nice little, just floating along this nice little consolidated surplus zone and adding as a consequence to what I like to akin to our family bank account. So this is the university's central reserve, all the colleges, all the units, all the support units. We share one bank account in the operating fund. And so someone else's pluses might be covering off someone else's minuses, but together we're in the green. But if we headed down this trajectory of what we saw on international enrollment and commingled with potentially not a lot of provincial funding support growth, we would hit that bankruptcy line in 2930. And we shared that with them in June. We shared them, here's what we look like if you give us 1%. Here's what we look like if you give us 2. Here's 3. We weren't the only one telling them this story. Across the province, so too were the other colleges. And as a consequence, on November 3rd, they committed to 3% per year operating grant lift. And someone asked me yesterday, I think, what do you think that'll mean for our percent of GDP? We're currently at 0.74. I think it'll creep up a little bit. Remember, the economy is growing as well, and I would hope that it gets us closer to 0.8, but I will remain on the fence until I sort of see. An investment in us is an investment in the economy. The question is, can we start to relate those graduates to impact? Can we start to relate our research findings to impact on society and the economy? That's the path to more investment. November 3rd came, and we took the results in. And sometimes when you give the August story, people react, and the deans and the leaders did react. The reaction I got in Q1 and Q2, was people are actually overcorrecting. And what I mean by that is the ones who had some of the money in the family bank account, the ones who had reserves and have spend plans, they are saying, whoa, we're in trouble, and they are slowing down materially their investments that they had planned. And so that 18 million deficit that we just saw is starting to turn into, for the current year, projected surplus. And I'd say that's good and bad. It's good if you were a college, school, or unit in deficit. If you're able to balance your budget, it's good. Here's where it's really bad, really bad. If you have a unit, if you're in a college or a support unit that has reserves, and you add to those reserves at this time when we just said we needed operating support in order to help the rest of the university, but you're already in a surplus position and now saving and pulling back on your expenses, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have to go to the government and show them our results. And they're going to say, well, we just gave you 3% because you said you were in trouble. We can't have these areas retract on their spend plans and add to their reserves if they're already high in reserves. So I'm giving you a mixed message. I'm saying if you're in deficit, please balance your budget. If you're not in a deficit and you have healthy reserves, please continue with your investment plans in people, in resources. Please do not forget that we presented a plan to the government, which was an approved plan with our board. And I don't want to go back to them and say here's what happened the last time we had too many reserves. Years ago, some of you will remember this in the room, we had the government come in and say, you have too much reserves. And what they did is they directed us to take out $40 million from the system, about thereabouts, and put it over to one particular college. And that can happen again. And I know that there are some colleges that remember that more painfully than others because they took a larger percent of that redistribution hit. So all I can say is that our strategy for finances is nuanced and not across the board. And it's intentionally nuanced because there are some colleges that are in investment mode and other colleges that are in saving mode. And it's dependent on what their unit level looks like, which is why Patty and I are going around college to college, school to school, support unit to support unit, giving them their own customized town hall. This is the last slide before I hand things over to my colleague here to talk about the MOU2 and accountability framework. This is important. What is it? 5 different colleges or schools. I've taken the names off to protect the innocent. 2 of them are in big trouble. Which 2 do you think are in big trouble? The green is the provincial support and tuition. And I told you it's not really inflating in concert with our expenses. The gray is other sources of revenue so that area has gone and attracted, and that they can price it each year and therefore build in inflation. The black is service contracts and activities they're doing for third party. They too can price it in their inflation. So who's in trouble? Yeah. This is a big deal. If this is your pie, if you talk to your dean and that's your pie, you guys should be having conversations. How do we diversify? The 2 that are in the least amount of trouble are the ones with the bigger gray, the ones that are in control of who they partner with, who they work with, and who they price with. And so at that stage, I'm going to just say, before I hand it over to Patty, we need to think about our impact, and we need to think about our revenue diversification, and we need to be nuanced with the financial challenges in front of us. Patty, my friend.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm the musical interlude between the numbers and the numbers. Dee has done such a wonderful job setting the stage and talking you through the recent announcement of MOU2. And I want to add just a little bit to that for your understanding, because really the goal is to create shared understanding of what are we doing, how are we doing it. So there was the base grant that you've heard about. That was a big part of that MOU2. Second, there was the agreement around tuition setting, and Dee has talked about that. The focus in the MOU2 is about undergraduate domestic tuition setting between 0 and 3%. Graduate tuition, international tuition, those things are exempted from that MOU2. Anytime when we have a tuition that is under the U15 comparator median, it is exempted from that MOU2. But that gives you enough for now on that. You'll hear more and more on that as we go through. Third part to talk a little bit about with you today is the accountability framework and the accountability reporting that is part of that MOU2. Keep in mind that there are 21 signatories to that Memorandum of Understanding. You would think about USask, U of R, SAS Poly, and then keep going, because it covers all of the 21 post-secondaries in the province. So what they've developed is a framework through which they will ask us to report on the investment that has been made in the University of Saskatchewan and all other 20 post-secondary institutions. Reporting on our performance is not new to the University of Saskatchewan, and we are ready, fully ready to undertake and had been undertaking it for quite some time. What's changed for us is the structure through which and the setting of metrics that we will be accountable for. So what you can see here, or what I would like you to take away from the slide behind me, is that the province has set out 3 goals for its post-secondary institutions. One is student success, the second is meeting the needs of the economy, and the third is financial sustainability. So those are the 3 goals for everyone in the post-secondary sector. Through that 3 goals and weaving in their expectations, they created 9 priorities. And that's what you see in the middle column. 9 priority areas that they want to see us making change, having an impact. Change and impact. So out of that 9 priorities, we were asked to develop a key performance indicator for each of them. How are you going to make those changes? How are you going to have that impact? And it is those 9 metrics, which in this slide you see on the far right, on your far right. Those are the ways that we will be reporting back to government. Now, all of those 9 metrics are backed up by activities. So we have a variety of activities that we have put forward that we know if we move in a certain direction, it will help us to lift, raise, grow, modify, and get those KPIs that we have committed to. This framework was given to us, so the priorities were given to us, the goals were given to us, and it was up to us to develop the key performance indicators. And so that was done through a consultation with deans and executive directors. We had to go around and ask, where can you contribute? You may not be able to touch all 9, but where can you? Where do you see the activities of your college and schools intersecting with what is asked of us? We also went to other senior leaders across all of the vice president portfolios. We went to Planning and Priorities Committee of University Council and talked about the development with them. So lots of individual, small group. Ultimately, this goes to the President's Executive Committee to be endorsed before it got submitted. What's changing, going the wrong way, what's changing on this second slide for you to note is simply that the key performance indicators that you saw on the far right, now in the middle, have to morph into targets. So what are we prepared to commit to? And you can see how we have operationalized in quantitative forms those targets. We are allowed to submit narrative information with these reports. We are allowed to tell the stories of how we are meeting our responsibilities and bringing to life these metrics. You can see here on that what is now the far right, that we, in only 2 of the 9 have we actually set our number. We have a little bit of time now. The accountability framework is in, but we have a little bit of time to do the work that we now need to do to see what is USask's baseline, what would be reasonable commitments over this next 4-year period to make changes in those areas. And that will be part of what we do going forward. Build and enhance the way we collect the information. We do not want this to be painful for colleges and schools and administrative units. In fact, we want it to be easy, and we want to try to absorb as much of that activity as possible so that when we get to this reporting on an annual basis, it will be easy and straightforward. The first report will go in June of 2026, and right now we're building those trend lines. I thought maybe the last thing I would say is just to take you through one example, right? These slides will be available, so you'll be able to see them. But you can imagine that it would not surprise you to see student success as a government priority. It's our priority as well. Priority A, students have the supports to be successful in post-secondary, including financial, academic, mental health, cultural, and career support. So that's the language they gave to us. We then created a background for that about what matters to us in that regard. We connected it into their documents. You see that along the bottom. They built this framework on the basis of their planning documents. We connected it into our appropriate and relevant planning documents. We have activity metrics for this one about how much money goes into student financial aid, how much money does the university spend in academic units and central administrative spending on staff who are involved in student support services. And then that results in a KPI about measuring the dollars and the amount of funding that goes into support USask students on an annual basis, and then that goes into a target. We will set a target, we will establish the baseline, and then set a target. Is that the last? Do I have another? Okay. Do you want me to come back to this? Okay. So, and D, this one might make a little bit more sense after Dee goes through some more of the fiscal situation. However, I'll pop this in now and say that recognizing, as you've seen in these slides, that we have work to do, our former interim provost Vince Bruni-Bosio signaled to the university some time ago that we would undertake a think tank in order to develop a set of activities that would help us to reduce expenses, grow and diversify revenue. And because Dee and I have been out and about doing smaller town halls, we recognize that for some people, particularly in cases where you're in a college that's been hard hit by drops in international enrollment, that the idea of a think tank, that you might think that we're just hanging around coming up with good ideas. In fact, that think tank has now evolved into collective action. There was a subset of those ideas about how to save money, how to make more money, that went into the colleges and units with the idea that here's a suite of things that you can do if they work for you in your college. Things like managing vacancies, right? We offer this as an opportunity, as an option. It may or may not work for you. There were other things that are pan-university, that cut across any one unit and thus need extra attention to try to organize them in a thoughtful way so that they could be useful. And some of these appear behind me here. So, for example, with thanks to our Vice President administration, we were able to save $1.3 million recently on review and renewal involving the printer fleet. Underway, things like reviewing our outsourced arrangement, consultants, things of that nature. Can we save in what we spend there? Better managing USask sponsorships and memberships. How can we coordinate that so that we're being more efficient in the very small non-discretionary funds that exist? Renewing systems, licensing escalation. How can we coordinate so as to reduce overlap so we're not paying money that we shouldn't have to or don't want to be paying? On the revenue generation side, some examples. Dee showed you the pies and greens and grays and where do you want to be, which pie do you want to be, and we were just talking about the diversification of revenue. So it has become apparent that if we had some resource in the area of business development tools and supports, that even a person, even a toolkit could help people, colleges, deans, et cetera, to come up with business ideas to diversify revenue. In addition, re-examining unused trust so we get donations. We are very good now in how we structure that in those terms of reference. In days gone by, decades ago, we didn't necessarily use the language that would allow us the flexibility to change course on the spending of that money. And as such, we have lots of money that is locked down that we cannot spend. If we can do a project to release some of that money, that could help in any number of ways. Simplifying our student fees strategy, growing expendable gifts, particularly in areas like student scholarships and awards, which donors are very tuned into, which could help bring relief to other parts of the operating budget. And finally, on this slide, debt financing for revenue that will enable us to advance capital projects. Thank you.
And so at this point, we're fairly a wrap and we're going to go to questions, but I want to just make sure that these strategies are, again, I'll use the word for nuanced use. I don't want to forget that some areas of this university, despite the challenges that we are facing because of our inflationary sources of revenue or not really keeping pace with our expenses, that every unit has to look at their own circumstances. And what we need is if you have savings and you had a plan to spend money, which has now been approved, it was approved back in April, to stick to that plan. If you're one of the few units that we've been tapping on the shoulder and meeting with, Patty and myself and others, to try and help you, whether you're doing a review or other additional work, looking at your expense profile and revenue profile, those units are the ones that we're working on saving the money. They're often the ones that also don't have savings. They already have an accumulated deficit. So again, we're not a one-size-fits-all university. we're unique, and we need individualized plans that fit, because what we don't want is for all the advocacy work that we just did and what we just achieved for the operating grant to it then be taken away from us because we failed to execute on the plans we put forward. At this point, I say thank you, and if you have any questions, I know we have one queued up here, but I'll call Heather. And I don't know if Cheryl is online. Oh, okay, we have Cheryl's answer. Okay, so we had a question, and I'll turn the mic over to you, and you can kind of go through it.
You bet. I just want to quickly say thank you to Dee and her team for their transparency and the enormous amount of work that they've put into this town hall and the continued work to make sure we're all informed. So thank you so much for that work. We have limited time for questions, so I'm going to start with one that Dee addressed in her presentation, but it comes up very often, and it came in as one of the submitted questions. Can the university address how the recently completed Be What the World Needs campaign of $570 plus million plays into the financial outlook and future plans? So, as I said, this was addressed, but to recap, the $570 million campaign success reflects the fundraising results of a 10-year campaign. And over this period, 80% of those funds have been received and either spent on donor-directed capital or equipment, or spent on donor-directed research initiatives, scholarships, student supports, including Indigenous supports, or permanently added to the endowment, where only the expendable interest income is used each year on the donor-directed purpose. Notice the donor-directed piece there. The remaining 20% reflects pledges or commitments from donors to give over future years for donor-directed purposes. And as part of the transparency, the campaign results report will be issued soon, and it gives more detail about how those funds are being used and what they will support. And in the meantime, we're in a year of gratitude, and the university relations team and the colleges continue to support the university with ongoing fundraising efforts, and there's a committed annual fundraising goal of $60 million. Also, when our next president is installed, there'll be a new strategic plan, and he'll be working with the campus community on that, and that will provide an anchor for the next large campaign. So thank you to Cheryl for that answer. If anyone would like to come to the mic, please line up. We ask that you keep your questions focused on the financial health of the university and as succinct as possible. In the meantime, maybe I'll move on to another submitted question. Will all employees see a raise in wages to counter the higher costs of living that we're dealing with? Dee, I'll ask you to answer that.
I called on a friend who's in the audience. So Marnie and I chatted before the town hall. Come on up to the mic, Marnie, and you can probably just speak from there and address the question.
Thanks for the question. The response relates to our process that we use to consider items like cost of living. And we engage in a process of collective bargaining with our 7 unionized groups. And our unions do a fantastic job of advocating for colleagues, and the monetary priorities within each group differ. And it's through that set of negotiations that we address items like cost of living.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have a question from the crowd.
Carrie Simonson from, can't even pronounce it, mechanical engineering. So I'm supposed to focus on a question, but I kind of want to preamble a little bit. I'm not from the School of Business, but I'll pretend I am for a bit, Vince. So I got a sense that the government is really looking for impact, and that was mentioned a few times. And then at the very bottom of one slide in yellow, we saw the growth plan as a small thing. We saw human resource development as another. And the growth plan, I think, was possibly a little bit smaller than it should have been, because that's the strategic plan for our current government. And what I found, and I'll just share this, is when I went through the growth plan, 30 goals for 2030, like over 20, maybe 22 of them required specifically engineers to deliver that plan. And I think if we did that in the other colleges, we'd find that you can't deliver that plan without all of the deliverables from this university. And then business analysis, and again, sorry about engineering, but that's my background, showed that the annual deliverables to the province from the College of Engineering was about $750 million, which was more than they were entirely investing in those 30 institutes across the province. And I think we'd have similar stories across the campus. And I guess the question is are you finding that kind of information is going to be receptive? Will it move the needle? And then I had sort of a second thought about these targets. We see, okay, we're going to have specific targets for ourselves, and that's really good. What about benchmarking? Like, how do we compare to these other institutes in those per FTE or per dollar or something like that? So kind of two questions. If you want to talk a little bit more about how set the government as our impacts, and then related to how we benchmark to others in these targets. So
yeah, and I can fractionally answer in the moments that we have, and probably call on Patty to add, but a couple of things. First and foremost, simple answer to the scaling issue is how long the words of the strategy were. So I'll take that back, and Kurt and I will work on a different visual here. No one box is meant to mean scale of effort. That said, when we look at funding and funding allocations from what we receive, not necessarily saying what we receive is sufficient for the need to support, whether it's engineering or law or whatever, from what we see, what we do look at, we try to use many evidence-based information points that we can, not just on setting tuition, but in terms of our allocation, what your SEM plan is, what your resourcing plan is, what your history has been, where you, what your ratios are to student teaching. So we try to garner information. What we do is we share with the deans the information we're looking at, and we ask the question, what information additionally would you like us to be looking at and taking into consideration? Beyond the data that we have from our own allocation and spend history, we also look at uniform data and the other comparative benchmarks. The only issue that we have with that data, which is great because it's benchmarks from around the world and other research-intensive universities, including several Canadian U15s, it doesn't get down into the granularity of this university, its college level spend, its college, so we're not getting the granularity that we would like. And then the other spot that we get data from for comparability and assessment is Stats Canada COBO reporting, which comes through each individual university's financial reporting. Patty, I have a sense that you'd be able to add.
I'm just going to say a couple quick things, Carrie, just in case there's someone else, because Dee's given a great answer about the benchmarking. I do want people to observe that there is very little on this framework about research. And that's not of our making. You can be rest assured that our first immediate question, number one, was, can we add a whole fourth column and call it research? Because we are a U15 and it's a priority for us to do that. Answer, no. I'm not in any way suggesting that there is a disregard, but what I am suggesting is that for the investment into our base budget, what you see before you are the priorities of our government. This does not mean that we are going to change course in our emphasis on and pursuit of research, but I do think that's an important observation. So yes, of course, interested in the province is very interested in engineering. You'll see in that 2B number of partnerships, based on research contracts, that's us. That's us manifesting a USask version of meeting the labor market needs. So a very important part. And then the other thing I wanted to say is towards towards the end of the presidency of President Stoichev and the beginning of the presidency of President Bruni Bassio, we will have an economic and social impact study. And when that gets released, it will be of great interest to people for some of the reasons that Carrie was talking about. And it tells a tremendous story that our current president, and incoming president will be talking a lot about.
Yeah,
Excellent.
can I just
And
add, I
that's-
hope that people use that study to look at the impact examples, to think about you for your area, what impact are you offering the economy or society, and help Heather get access to those stories.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what my question was more about, not about internal division, but how we grow the pie. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, we really do need to tell our story better. And directly, because of what I said about across Canada, our percentage share of investment as GDP, we need to link what we do and how busy we are to impact on the economy and society, societal health, society wellness. And then that's an avenue for that investment growth. The only other thing to add on his question was just a reminder from what Patty said, the very beginning, the federal government, when we sit down with them, are very interested in our research agenda. The provincial government is very interested in our education graduate agenda. Together is what makes us strong, USask, research and intensive, student-centered. So it'll be really interesting. These are 9 targets. What we're going to see when Vince, who's here today, works with us on the next strategic plan is beyond these 9 targets, we will have another set of university targets that are very meaningful to us. And this subset will go to the province. A broader subset with the research intensity will go to the board.
We're getting down to very few minutes left, but I think there's one question that we want to ask is, what are the barriers to USask participating in a financial boycott, divestment, and sanctions of the government of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question for any global issue at which global issues will change over the vintage of time. We know that by looking backwards. The university is a federally and provincially funded organization. We follow our federal and provincial governments' bans and boycotts. So the federal government, if you go online, has a website of their current bans and sanctions, and we adhere to that. Additionally, we also adhere to any provincial directive that we get. You might recall we softened the language in our past town hall slides, but we talked about one that we received last year. It was a kind letter from our province asking us after the tariff issues arose to refocus our buying efforts to Saskatchewan first and Canada second. And so we follow federal and provincial guidelines.
I think we have time for one more question. So how are budget-induced reductions in services being communicated across campus?
Pick the
Yeah.
easiest
Yeah,
one, did
that's-
ya? You had a whole list. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that because our resource allocation isn't keeping pace with inflation, the way the university as a whole, our distribution of expenses, where 70% of our expenses are people, 30% are those institutional costs, so the insurance, the lighting, the hydro, et cetera. So when you look at the fact that we're heavily anchored on a people-driven organization, if a unit didn't get enough to fund their inflation, they could look first and foremost at, can they cut some expenses, or ideally grow their gray matter, grow their other inflows, if you will. But ultimately, when all other pathways are exhausted and they're now making the tougher decision to cut services because maybe they're attritioning down their team or something down that nature, then we ask those leaders, so VP leaders, the department heads that roll up to the VP leaders, to have that conversation at president exec and then to broaden that communication quite widely so that it's understood what were all the efforts that were taken, what is the rationale, do people appreciate what the choice was of the service reduction. So if you're feeling like you've received received a notice of a service rejection, I would certainly hope, and we continue to have dialogue at the President Exec Committee table, that the VPs, the unit leaders, they need to bring forward the considerations they're making for service rejection. Because the one thing that we hear, despite our financial challenges, is people want more services, they want more support. So we need to strike a balance, and it needs to be based on our fiscal reality.
I think we're at time. To help answer that communications question, since it's in my title, but this event, this town hall, this recording, and the ability to send questions to strategic finance so they can be answered. There are more questions that were submitted, and they will be answered in a way that we can all gather on that website and learn and make sure that we have accurate information for this. So again, thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you, Dee. Do you have anything else you wanted to?
Thank you guys for coming and showing continued interest in sharing with me this journey of financial interesting situations.